Alright guys, I guess I'm going to do a little Tech Tip Tuesday, which is kind of a new thing for me. We've got this is our LSA mock-up motor. There's an LSA in my Suburban over there, and the shop is an absolute mess because we're getting ready to move. So don't mind all the superchargers on the ground and tires everywhere and everything else. So, extra motors everywhere and all my electrical nonsense, as well as our X-Max setup here. So we've got our test bench set up on a tote lid and a little stand, but we've already got a base cal in this, and I've done some settings on it, and obviously everything like the throttle body and everything already works. We already got all the TPS stuff set. We'll have to reset it once it's in the car, but it all works. So today's video is going to basically be related to oil pressure sensors or any sensor in general. Now, I always like to make sure that all of my stuff is calibrated and scaled properly before it's in the car. So, for example, we've got some of these sensors. These are like a low dollar or a Holley or an AEM, or pretty much they're all the same within maybe a couple percent of each other. This is a 100 PSI unit. We've got a 300 PSI that will run on something like a trans pressure. 100 PSI, we've got this one on our fuel pressure, and we want to make sure that they're scaled correctly. And we ran into an issue the other day. I was trying to get our oil pressure senders calibrated, and so I grabbed this one out of the parts bin. It's just a typical Gen 4 GM LS3 style pressure sensor, and it was doing something weird. And I'll probably have to pause the video a few times since I only have one hand to do all this. But we have our little pressure adapter here that's got an M16 1.5 on it, to an NPT, so we can actually hook it up to air and see what it does. Now, I've already got this one scaled, and we actually had to use a custom table or a custom scale to get this one to read correctly. And so we got our computer on, we've got our laptop over here. So if we go into our data log and we go into our gauges, right now we've got our 0 PSI reading. And if I go over here and actually plug it in would help. Come on, where's my pigtail? There it is. Let's plug our pigtail in here. This might actually help. But you want to make sure you do have a 0 PSI reading when it's unplugged, because if you're scaled incorrectly, you will have something weird going on. So, oops, I plugged it into I plugged it into fuel pressure, not into so you can see fuel pressure is going up. I plugged it into the fuel pressure port, not the oil pressure port here. Oil pressure, there we go. Okay, so turn the regulator all the way down. I'm gonna have to go back and forth here. Hopefully you guys don't get motion sickness. So we're at 0 PSI. Let's go up to, let's get it right on 40 here. Right on 40. And 39, close enough. Same thing if we crank it all the way up to 100. On here, we got 100. And we're at 100. So same thing. I mean, it's pretty well calibrated for, if it's within 1 PSI, I call it good. So if we get out of our logger here, stop logging, back up. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. There we go. So if we go into our sensors, we go to oil pressure, and we've got a custom pressure set up here. Now, most of these sensors are going to go from 0.5 volts to 4.5 volts, and you can figure out where you are in between there. And we knew that I was getting roughly 3.7 volts at 100 PSI. So I basically found a value that was a little bit higher than that, put the slope in, and then I would just adjust this 129 value up and down until this value was where we wanted it. So rather than try to do each individual point and make it linear that way, it was easier just to scale it all and fill rows and make it one straight scale. So I'm going to pause this and go back to the other sensor, and we'll see what it does. All right, and we're back. So I swapped in the black sensor for the brown one, and we're at 0 PSI. We got no air. So let's go back to our logger here and our gauges. and we read 0. So let's crank it up to 20 psi, and we still read 0. So let's crank it up to 60 psi. Now we've got 11. And so on and so forth. So if I crank it up to, let's go all the way to 100 pounds here. So that's 100 psi, and we've got 53 psi here. So basically this sensor is dead below, let's see, I think about, 40, we're at 48 pounds right now, and we're basically reading 1 psi of oil pressure. So if you had a car that made 60 pounds cold, and you had never put a gauge on this car before, and fired it up and said, wait a second, I'm only making 14 pounds of oil pressure, that's what the Holley would tell you, and you might say, okay, maybe I got to pull the motor out. So be careful, because this thing might not be always that accurate. So we're going to go into here just so we can have a reference here. We're going to go to GM LS 0 psi offset. We're going to send it to the ECU, and I'm sure we're going to have to power cycle it. So we're going to power cycle our ECU. ECU is off. ECU is on. And then we're going to go back into our logging, back into our gauges. Still reading 15 psi. So the scaling is not that far off from where I had the custom table versus the GM one. But again, as soon as we hit 0 psi, we are still at 40-something, 44 psi on our gauge. So this is one of the reasons why we like to calibrate this stuff before we put it in the car, because I'll show you guys if I can walk over here. And again, apologies for the shop being an absolute disaster. Getting to the oil pressure sensor on this particular setup means you have to take the lid off and get back here. It's not like a regular truck intake where you can reach around the side. So it takes a little bit longer to get to that sensor if you wouldn't have found out that that sensor was bad until you got the engine fired up. Luckily, I know what this motor makes. It has stock gauges in it for right now, so I know that it makes 60 psi cold on 1540. And if I would have fired up the Holley and it would have said 15 or 10 psi, I would have known, hey, something's not right. And if I would have had to pull the lid off again just to change out an oil pressure sensor, I would have been pretty pissed. So I guess that's the tech tip of the day. And yeah, just calibrate all your sensors before you put the thing in. Whip up a little test bench, even if it's a little ATX power supply. We've got a bunch of these old computer grade setups that we keep handy from eBay or Radio Shack back in the day, and they provide plenty of clean power for stuff like this, and gives you an opportunity to check all this stuff before you put it in the car. So we are possibly thinking about making an adapter like this as a production item, where it's got the 16 millimeter port on this side and a 1/4 MPT on this side. This is one I just made in the manual lathe real quick, but you know what, if there's an interest in something like this, hey, I'll make it. So yeah, that's tech tip of the day, and I'm gonna go back to work. Everyone have a great week.